Nu se oprească.
David, oprește-l pe ăsta.
Hello, dear friends. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I would like, first of all, I would like you to turn off your microphones to make sure that it will not interfere with our communication. I am Denise Vasiliu. I'm your host for this wonderful meeting. I am here to greet you from Iași, Romania, in the name of the organizing team of this event and of the C.S. Lewis conferences in Iași, Romania. Some of you have already been here. Most of you maybe wonder where this place is. Iași is the second largest city of Romania, situated in the eastern part, and it is considered the cultural and the spiritual capital of the country. It is a beautiful city with about 50,000 student population. And our university is the very place where The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, written by C.S. Lewis, was the first time translated into Romanian more than 20 years ago. Here, the story of making C.S. Lewis and the Inklings started. We are trying to make them known, and we have been traveling this journey for more than 7 years now. And here we have founded the C.S. Lewis and Kindred Spirit Society, dedicated to promoting the heritage and other kindred spirits alike, the heritage of C.S. Lewis and other spirits kindred alike, mainly in the post-communist countries. In order to have an idea of our history, we have prepared a short movie. I hope it will work now that we are all on Facebook. We will just try, and you know that things are complicated with the Zoom, but we are trying. Well, I'm
You're muted, Denise.
yes. Thank you again, and I'm so happy that we are all here, part of the second edition of the C.S. Lewis and Kindred Spirits Connected. Professors, students, members of several C.S. Lewis societies and other Inkling societies, reading lovers, and Inklings enthusiasm. We have people from more than 20 countries registered for this conference, and we are very, very happy. We are here part of a wonderful story because in this terrible context of the COVID pandemic, a time of great loss for all of us, we are trying to build something new and beautiful, a worldwide community that celebrates the great heritage of the Inklings, not only their scholarship, but also the core of what they really loved, faith, friendship, enjoying sharing truth and great ideas. This is why we have two great speakers. But before introducing them, I will introduce the wonderful host that will mediate this complicated conversation about imagination. And this is our friend Kirsten Johnson, who is from Canada. She is George MacDonald Scholar. She has been coming to Romania for many years, and she has been a great part in everything we have tried to do here. And we are just thrilled to pass this to her and to welcome her to lead this conversation. Here are the countries that are represented in this meeting, and now we invite Kirsten.
Thank you, Denise. That's quite incredible to see. Welcome, everyone. It's a privilege to be joining you all, both friends in Romania, but friends from around the world. As we move into the chat time, I think because we aren't going to be able to pull up Malcolm and Brenton and I on the screen, just us at the same time, what I might ask you to do just during this conversation time is turn off your visuals. And then when we get back to the question time, we can all see each other again. But I think it'll be easier for the gents to be able to converse with each other and process the questions if we do that. Thank you so much, guys. And a reminder again, because I forget repeatedly, for most of you to turn on your mute, and for Brenton and Malcolm and myself to turn off our mute.
Excellent.
Right.
Okay. So people are closing down there so that we just have, so everybody turns off their camera except for Brenton and Malcolm and myself. And then it'll be exciting to see you all afterwards. Thanks. It is a true honor for me today to introduce Malcolm and Brenton to you. I could talk about how much I enjoy both of these gentlemen for quite a long time, but that's not what we're here to do today. But just a little background if they are new to you. The Reverend Dr. Malcolm Guite is a fellow of Girton College at Cambridge, where he was also a chaplain. And he's recently retired to focus on his writing and sharing of poetry, not just his writing of poetry, but also his sharing of poetry, his own and that of others. Yet he also continues to teach and share academically, as well as in the broader sphere outside of the academic walls, if you will. And if you have not visited Malcolm's delightful channel on YouTube, I encourage you to go join him there for particularly his Spells in the Library, which are short invitations that draw you into his study For those of you who grew up with the children's television show, The Friendly Giant, Malcolm is our new friendly giant, drawing you into a deep world of literature. And if you're also interested in hearing, I would say, a quite riveting interview on Canada's national radio station, afterwards Google CBC Radio and Malcolm Guite, and you should be able to come up with the program from Tapestry that Malcolm did just a couple of weeks ago, about one of his poems that a presenter on CBC had read and actually hunted down Malcolm to ask him to speak about a poem that she thought was quite appropriate for the times today. Malcolm's most recent literary study is a book called Mariner, A Voyage with Samuel Taylor Coleridge. And he's also just published a poetic response to the Psalms called David's Crown. If you go to the website or the blog site of either of these gents, you'll find more of the works that they've done. And Malcolm is a visiting professor at numerous institutions in numerous countries. I would get in trouble if I did not point out that he is the president of the George MacDonald Society, for which we are very grateful. And a delight that he and I share in particular, that of the work of George MacDonald. And he's lived in England, in Canada, and in Nigeria. I wish that you could go out for a walk in nature with Malcolm. Not only is he pretty impressive at knowing the names of the plants and creatures that he sees, but he can pluck out of his memory the most appropriate poems and quotations for the setting to recite there on the spot. And I wish for you all that someday you get to experience that fun. And in the meantime, you can work on doing it yourself in honor of Malcolm. Dr. Brenton, getting Trouth mobile, as my brother would say here. Dr. Brenton Dickinson, that'll slow me down, is based on Canada's East Coast, Prince Edward Island, the home of Anne of Green Gables. Many of you may not know where PEI is, but you'll have heard of Anne of Green Gables. And Brenton is also a professor and lecturer at several universities and institutions, including the entirely online Signum University. Brenton's lived on both the West Coast and the East Coast of Canada, as well as in Japan. And true to his home and native land, he's not only a professor of literature and of spiritual theology, a C.S. Lewis and Inklings scholar, but he is also a scholar of Lucy Maud Montgomery, the author of Anne. Brenton hosts a very popular Pilgrim in Narnia blog, where you will find a mix of all manner of things to challenge both your brain and your heart, your full imagination. Brenton also writes fictional literature, like Malcolm does, in addition to academic literature. And I believe both gents write songs. Am I correct on that?
Yes, that's very true.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't write good ones.
That's for your audience to judge, Brenton.
Yeah, I write fireside ones. Malcolm writes like stage ones.
If you're a student at a conference, Brenton is the professor who will hang out with you and your friends until the wee hours of the morning, exploring deep questions, as well as inviting you into deep fun. And this is something that I admire in both of these men, that for both of these gentlemen, and it's really important for me to let you all know that these scholars, for them, people are more important than books and learning.
Sure.
And that's a legacy that at least has resonated in many of the books and authors we're going to talk about today, and something that I believe resonates with them. And I love how both of these men model that. And I think you'll see glimpses of that today. Now, as we proceed, we're gonna talk a little more broadly about imagination. We're going to zoom in a little bit on C.S. Lewis, and then with his kindreds, and then pull back a little bit wider again before the audience question time. I'm aware that not everyone here is necessarily going to be familiar with the term Inklings, which will pop up a lot. This team is being hosted by the C.S. Lewis and Kindred Society, but you often hear us reference the Inklings. And the Inklings are originally just very brief form. Apologies to those of you who are Inkling scholars that this is so brief and not specific, but loosely it was a group of scholars, be they in the academy or not, who gathered to discuss literature and read their writings to each other in Oxford. And we sort of formed a group of friends. And there's loose, different people came in and out, but C.S. Lewis was an anchor member, and J.R.R. Tolkien, who's the Lord of the Rings, and Owen Barfield and Charles Williams. Often when the term is used, we kind of pull in Dorothy Sayers, who was a friend of many of these gents, not part of that discussion group, but engaged with them all. And then even more broadly, sometimes we pull in G.K. Chesterton, who's kind of like a father figure to some of them literarily, and then George MacDonald, who's kind of like a grandfather to them all. So when we talk about the Inklings, we may loosely be referring to that general group of writers who were very interested in the imagination and how the imagination shapes and potentially changes our worldview and how we engage with the world, and exploring that in their writing. Now, within that context, we're here with the C.S. Lewis and Kindred Spirit Society. And Brenton, being PEI, Anna Green Gables country resident, Lucy Montgomery is probably the person who made that phrase the most familiar to at least many people in English-speaking language, kindred spirits. So, Brenton, could you just briefly kind of unpack to us what is meant by kindred spirits for those for whom the phrase is new?
Yeah, sure. I actually like how it's used in this context in Romania because I've been using the phrase honorary Inklings when I write as a way to describe those connected with or influenced by or that influence. And so this is kind of a cool thing. Anne of Green Gables was a character that burst out of Prince Edward Island, off the page and into the world about 110 or 111 years ago, and was quickly translated into European languages, although I don't know when the Romanian translation took place, and became internationally famous for her energy, her lifeness. And she absolutely transforms her little world. She's an orphan girl who's accidentally adopted. They were expecting a boy to do farm work, and this girl showed up. And so they do a trial to see if she would be a good fit because she's kind of a homely, lonely thing. And she fails almost every step of the trial. And in doing, and the old couple that adopt her, then in learning to live with Anne, discover grace and a sense of hope and a new life within them. And Anne discovers that these two sort of quiet or strict or almost grumpy sometimes old people that adopt them are actually kindred spirits. They're friends of the heart. They share something that you couldn't see on the outside that links them on the inside, and it has to do with imagination and a sense of possibility, but also I think a sense of humor in amidst it all. And I think so. Kindred spirits, I think, is a nice name for that the way that the Inklings help a larger group kind of play in the imagination and connect with one another, even though there's a lot of diversity in the way we look or the way that we study the world and things like that. There. So is that it? Is that the Lucy Maud in Romanian? And when would that have been? Because the first ones were Swedish, I think. Yeah.
This edition is 2000. I don't know if there was a previous one.
Yeah. I would be surprised. Yeah, it might have been a while ago. It might have been some time ago. But yeah, so Anne of Green Gables became this global, brilliant figure, and I think that's a good name.
Thank you, Brenton, and thank you, Professor Albu, for showing us the title there too. I love that phrase, Brenton, friends of the heart. That is beautiful. I'm going to ask both of these gents to share with us, just to give us one last glimpse of your personality a little bit, one of your own favorite personal epiphanies elicited by a Lewis and Kindred's read. But Malcolm, leading into that, could you also just give us a little list of who are some of those people that you would put in that category of kindreds?
Oh, kindred spirits. Well, I also love that. The sense of kindred spirits and people who've inhabited your imagination, who've enlivened and enlarged it and kindled it, and with whom in that sense, among authors, you have imaginary conversations. So because I, as a boy, loved both Lewis and Tolkien and read the Narnia books and The Hobbit, I wanted those books to talk with each other, and I had imaginary conversations with Lewis and Tolkien, asking them more about their worlds. And I imagined conversations between the two of them. So I was absolutely delighted when I discovered that, in fact, in real life, they had known each other and cared for each other, and discovered, for example, that it was the sympathetic and imaginative listening of C.S. Lewis to Tolkien when he was beginning The Lord of the Rings. And it was such a crazy thing to do, and nobody imagined it could be done. And Lewis says for a long time he was Tolkien's only reader, you know. So he kept going.
Yeah, that's right.
So I think the kindred spirits is, I mean, kindred is a lovely word. I mean, you know, it goes right back into I mean, kin, in the sense of being kinned with someone. That word itself is rooted to the word kind, which is both the kind of person we are. You know, God makes each in their own kind. And the word kind came to mean kind, to be kind and generous to one another, because that was supposed to be the kind of thing humankind was. And hence the phrase of Shakespeare, the milk of human kindness. And so I think there's a sense when you recognize a kindred spirit, first of recognition that there's a kind of spiritual or imaginative kinship, and then that you are the same kind of person. But in the end, I think one of although the Inklings loved to disagree and to argue with one another, they modeled something we desperately need in this world, which is that people who recognize that they are of the same kind, or that they are kindred. And that very recognition and reassurance allows them to discuss ideas very vigorously, and to disagree with each other, and to sharpen each other's blade, as it were. And Lewis loved to be disagreed with. I was I'm very fortunate to have a few, just because of the way things work in England and connections in universities and English society, sort of living connections. So people who knew Lewis, as it happens, my father-in-law was one of his students and was very much in awe of him when he was a student of his reading English in Oxford in the 30s. But it was only the day his relation with Lewis kindled, to use another kin word, kindled and became, was when he had the temerity to disagree with Lewis about something and argue his own point. And Lewis loved that. And immediately, you know, part of the kindredness was the willingness to argue about the things you cared about. And in fact, when you look at the people we think of as kindred spirits with Lewis, you know, Lewis starts off as an atheist and makes some of these friends while he's still an atheist, but partly through the kindliness and kindredness and kindling of imagination through them, he becomes a Christian. In fact, he becomes an Anglican. But his great friend Tolkien is a Roman Catholic, and Owen Barfield, their friend, is a sort of mystic, really, and doesn't quite fit into any sort of church categories, but eventually gets baptized to the great rejoicing of Lewis. And confirmed. And then you know, Charles Williams is another person who's taken a much more strange and mystical route, but something draws them together. And there's all that kind and kindredness. But of course, in the end, as C.S. Lewis says in his very beautiful essay on friendship in The Four Loves, there is a host. We must not reckon, he says, without our host. And you know, there was a book written by Humphrey Carpenter about the Inklings, which was full of interesting information, but concluded in the end, the only thing that kept the Inklings together was that they all happened to be friends of C.S. Lewis's. I think Humphrey Carpenter was wrong about that. Lewis says we must not reckon without our host. And in the end, I think all those kindred spirits would acknowledge that not only the great spirit, the spirit of God that sends forth, but that Christ himself was in some sense gathering this company together. And it was in some sense both their love of him and his grace and love for them that held them together. Not in a very, you know, organized religious pious way or anything like that at all, because for them the vivid reality of God was not, it was not something you put in a special religious box and always talked about in special religious terms. I think they all had a very strong sense that God was the Logos who was speaking them and everybody else in the world and the world itself into being, and that they were sustained together in a great story God, the Word, was himself telling. And I think they all had in common a sense that storytelling, all kinds of storytelling, would eventually make you understand the bigger story that you're part of. I mean, they started, Lewis and Tolkien together, reading the Icelandic sagas together, which are wonderful stories of wildness and mystery. But in the end, as Tolkien put it in his very fine essay on fairy stories, maybe the thing that makes your heart suddenly leap, or kindles you in a fairy story, is itself only an echo of the great, he called it eucatastrophe, the great sudden good turn of things, which is the resurrection. So I think, although you can discuss them, as long as you like, in purely literary terms, you can discuss them in philosophical terms, you can discuss them in social terms, but there is something, to be frank, supernatural, something spiritual in the deepest sense, which is organizing and holding them together.
Yeah, absolutely.
So let's pull more deeply into that hard to explain thing that holds them together. And why don't we just zoom further into, when we're pushing into the imaginative sense of that. Let's start with you, Brenton. Can you tell us what you understand the imagination to be? And then we'll get Malcolm to pick up on that, because the imagination is so big. We're going to be able to fill in so many pieces of this for days. So just little glimpses from each of your brains right now, and how you understand what the imagination is, and how maybe let's pull into that, how these guys have pulled you into that.
Yeah, that's really, it's sort of an intriguing question. And so folks should know that Kirsten and Malcolm and I met a couple of days ago to kind of plan what we would talk about. And each time I'm asked about the imagination, I feel myself actually getting further away from a precise definition and finding a bunch of words less and less the way to answer the question. And so I sat and I made a visual mind map of all the things that I could think were connected with C.S. Lewis and imagination. I didn't get to George MacDonald and Tolkien because I ran out of paper. There was just not enough space on the paper. And so I want to kind of, there's a lot of ways. I think that Malcolm will talk about organs of meaning. I think that's one of the things you're drawn to in your work, Malcolm. But I actually want to begin with sort of one of my awakenings to what the Inklings could do for our imagination and the way that we live in the world, if I can. And I mean, if you want just a quick definition of imagination, we can do that, but let's do this. And it's actually his poem that we call Mythopoeia. And I'm just going to pop into the chat. I'll just pop the link to, it's just, I copied it on my blog. I plagiarized it on my blog, but it's shared a lot on the internet. You can find it. And it was actually, I had picked this poem for my students to read about a decade ago. And because I just loved that it came out of this moment in C.S. Lewis and J.R. Tolkien, where they're all reading these grand stories, and they don't know that they're going to be the shapers of the imagination of the 20th century and the 21st century. They don't know that they have anything that will. Middle Earth is just little bits of words and poems and names and stories, and Narnia is pretty far away. It's just a picture in C.S. Lewis's head of a faun with an umbrella and a snowy wood and some packages, right? That's all there is. There's not even a full imagination of what's possible, and they're talking about the stories that they love to read. And Lewis, in his way, who was a great reader of myths, as Malcolm already talked, said that myths were lies breathed through silver. So gorgeous betrayals, in a sense, of the imagination. So they enliven the imagination, but they're not founded in something that roots them beyond the imaginative, or something like that. Anyway, they are beautiful lies if you love the myths, if you love the kind of story that roots you to the great world beyond or in the heart. And so Tolkien kind of went home, and I don't know how he ever finished the poem. He wasn't great at kind of finishing things off, but I think this one came pretty quickly. And he wrote a poem called From Myth Lover to Myth Hater. And but he used the Latin names, and he says, if I can just quote a little bit of it, Malcolm probably hasn't memorized, and he probably translated it back into Latin, and then he can recite it in Latin to the trees as he walks through the woods. But I actually I'm not good at the memorizing, and so I'll just read a little bit. Tolkien says, "You look at trees and you label them just so, for trees are trees and growing is to grow, right? Just like a botanist. You walk the earth and tread with solemn pace one of the many minor globes of space. A star's a star, some matter in a ball, compelled the course is mathematical. Amid the regimented cold inane, where destined atoms are each moment slain." Now, this was it was actually teaching this, sitting with my students, teaching this, that all of a sudden this poem came alive to me in a way that I hadn't prepped for in my lecture notes. And I was blown away just in these first few words, because I suddenly saw C.S. Lewis's first book of poetry, long before he was a Christian. The cold death of the universe was one of the big themes. That space is just something that will collapse in on itself. And science betrays him, because in the end it's just names. And then there was that moment in Voyage of the Dawn Treader,
Yes.
right, where they're meeting a number of people. It's a Narnian journey by boat this time, and I think, Malcolm, you'll confess this is one of your favorites, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And this book has so many other books in it. Homer, the Homer's books, and all the great Arthurian tales are there, and Rime of the Ancient Mariner is there, and everything is there in this book. And it's just this brilliant moment where at one point the Voyagers, they meet a retired star, and one of the poor boys on the ship, who reads a lot more nonfiction than fiction, but he's kind of a recovered person at this point. He says, "A retired star, but aren't stars like burning balls of gas a billion miles away?" To quote Pumbaa from Disney's what was that, Lion's Story, whatever that story is, the Jungle Book, or what, I can't remember. Anyway, yeah, the Lion King, that's it. Yeah. And so that's kind of an interesting connection. But and so poor Eustace quotes this from a math textbook or a science textbook about what a star is, and then Ramandu, the retired star, says, my son, you've misunderstood really what we're talking about, right? That's what stars are made of. That's not what they are, right?
Yeah.
There's something deeper and greater and bigger. And then all of a sudden I understood everything that was going on with Lewis. And that how there was this whole, like, all the simple story that flows along, that we read as children, we read to our children, we read as adults. Sometimes we did it pretending to be reading more serious things. Sometimes we have the courage to be nerds and just read this fantasy stuff. And we read it, and all of a sudden it just came alive, that there was all these layers and worlds beneath the story. And then there's this other moment in this poem where basically the poem is basically saying, no, we're not going to reduce everything we know about the world just to its names, to its anatomical weight, to where it fits on a chart or a spreadsheet. That, for Tolkien, that's not the truth of the world, and I really resonated that. And then he goes further into the poem, talking about, how, blessed are the legend makers, that we are little makers, having been made. And this idea of Tolkien and subcreation, that in the way that God has shaped the whole world, God has made us to be little makers in our own domains. And so we weave stories, we fill the world with story, parents and teachers and artisans and friendship and, love and service. And there's all kinds of ways to be a little maker. But I just really came to understand what that all meant. And so for me, Kirsten, when we talk about imagination, and what probably Malcolm will talk about the two organs of meaning, the spheres of the mind, for me, my copy of Mere Christianity is filled with beach sand. There's beach sand from Prince Edward Island. We have beaches. There's beach sands from Vancouver. There's beach sand from Japan. There's beach sands from Thailand, where I vacationed once. Where each time I went on vacation, I tried to read Mere Christianity, and I got it, through the interesting apologetic stuff, and then got lost. And then though, reading this poem, all of a sudden I understood the whole, that there was this unification in Lewis's mind between the images, the story, the rhythm, the dance, the poetry, and the deep meaning behind things. And I just had to allow those two things to sit together. And so Narnian Mere Christianity sits on my shelf closely now. So that for me is imagination, the way that all those things come together, those truths come together in one. Yeah, sorry. Yeah.
No,
it's a little
that's
long, but it was a story in my head. Yeah.
And Brenton, it really sets us up quite well too, for Malcolm to pull in to his unpacking what Lewis means when he says reading the novel by George MacDonald called Phantastes baptized his imagination.
Yeah.
So Malcolm, can you tie those together
Yeah.
for us?
Okay, so can I just start by saying, yeah, I'm so glad Brenton picked up that poem Mythopoeia. It's not only a great poem of Tolkien's, but addressed to Lewis, but it's also was a crucial kind of turning point, not only in the friendship, but actually in Lewis's own journey to Christ.
I think so.
The description of the as it were, description of the myth hater.
Yeah.
Just, oh, come on, all of this is just airy fairy made up nonsense and nothing. It's lies. It may be breathed through silver, but it's not the case. The case is that the world is just an agglomeration of meaningless stuff, and we're just atoms bouncing around, and all of the stuff that later on Eustace says. So Lewis's mind before this moment had to some degree, or at least one part of his mind, had been completely captured by the very reductive account of the world, which has lots of facts, interesting facts, true facts, important facts about the physicality of stuff, but which has no place either for meaning or beauty or joy or hope. But if you think about it, an account of the world that has no place, that has no way of giving an account or a source of meaning and beauty and joy and hope, is not in fact a full account of the world. Yeah. It's an account, to go back to that moment in The Voyage of the Dawn Treader, of what the world is made of, but not what it actually is. And the great journey for Lewis through this conversation with Tolkien, but also through an earlier series of conversations he'd had with his friend Owen Barfield, was to discover that the imagination was a bit more than what he thought it was. That it wasn't just pretty stories we can make up just to decorate the insides of our minds, to compensate ourselves for the grim reality that's out there. That actually it might be part of how we perceive. It might be an organ which, like the organs, the eyes or the ears or the nose, give you a clue to what's actually out there. And it might be that we were looking at the world through only one eye instead of two. But that by looking at the world through the eye of reason alone, we could assert certain things to be true, but we didn't know what they added up to, how they held together, and what, deepest of all, they might be trying to say to us. So in the end, finally, Lewis got to a beautiful formulation that reason is the natural organ of truth, but imagination is the organ of meaning. You need reason, and you must follow reason to find out what is the case. But you also need a kind of intuitive, kindled, imaginative grasp, a sense of a sense of awe, a sense of wonder, a sense that these things are not only what they are in themselves, but they're telling you something. Now, Lewis himself, as I'm sure you know, described the state of his mind prior to that conversation with Tolkien in his spiritual autobiography, Surprised by Joy. He says, the two hemispheres of my mind were in the sharpest contrast. On the one side, a many-islanded sea of poetry and myth. That was Lewis's guilty pleasures, reading the stories of Balder the Beautiful. But then he was a hardcore philosophy teacher in Oxford. He wasn't an English teacher at that point. And on the other, therefore, he says, on one side, a many-islanded sea of poetry and myth. On the other, a glib and shallow rationalism. Nearly all that I loved, I believed to be imaginary. Nearly all that I believed to be real, I thought grim and meaningless. Now, you see, Lewis is there trapped in the same thing that a lot of people have when they hear the word imagination, or they think it means imaginary in the sense of made up, not real. They forget the thing that in the course of making and telling a story, many realities are made manifest. They forget the obvious fact, which Shakespeare had made so clear in A Midsummer Night's Dream, when he wrote about how poetry works. He says, you know, imagination apprehends more than cool reason ever comprehends. And then talking about the great myth makers and storytellers of the kind Lewis and kindred spirits, he said, you know, the poet's eye in fine frenzy rolling doth glance from heaven to earth, from earth to heaven. And as imagination bodies forth the form of things unknown, the poet's pen turns them to shapes and gives to airy nothing a local habitation and a name. So actually storytelling can be a way of getting at truth. Now, it happens that Lewis himself, prior to this conversation with Tolkien, at about the time that he's describing in when he says the two hemispheres of my mind were in sharpest contrast, wrote a poem which was published posthumously. We didn't have this poem in print until 1964, although it was probably written in about 1926 or 7. And it was published under the title Reason, although in fact I've discovered that it wasn't called Reason by Lewis. It didn't have a title, and I think if did have a title, the title would just be Who. And this is Lewis a year or two before his conversion, trying to work out how to live with this divided self between the things the stories he'd love but he thinks aren't true, and the things he knows that are true and that he mustn't forget are true. And yet he knows there must be some way of reconciling them. And of course, Tolkien gave him that hope, that there might be something in our imagination and in our making which is given of God and therefore connected to the truth. So Lewis wrote this poem, which I'll just briefly recite to you because it's a remarkable poem. In this poem, he imagines his own soul, but it could be any one of us, as like ancient Athens, with the Acropolis, the beautifully sort of perfectly geometrical sculptured temple of Athene, where Athene represents pure mathematical reason, if you like, the really what is the case, 2 and 2 will always be 4. But then there are the mystery religions, and there's Demeter, the mother goddess, and he uses Athene on the one hand and Demeter on the other to represent these two great powers in all of our souls, reason and imagination. And he honestly says he can't get them together, but he wants to, and he asks for somebody to come and do that for him. So he says, set on the soul's Acropolis, the reason stands, a virgin armed, commercing with celestial light. And he who sins against her has defiled his own virginity. No cleansing makes his garment white, so clear is reason. I.e., he's saying, if you know something is true, then even if you don't want it to be true, you've just got to hang on to the fact that it's the case. But then he does this contrast, so clear is reason. But how dark imagining. Warm, dark, obscure and infinite, daughter of night. Dark is her brow, the beauty of her eyes with sleep is loaded, and her pains are long and her delight. Tempt not Athene, wound not in her fertile pains Demeter, nor rebel against her mother right. And then comes the great cry from Lewis. Oh, who will reconcile in me, both maid and mother, who make in me a concord of the depth and height, who make imagination's dim exploring touch ever report the same as intellectual sight. Then could I truly say and not deceive, then could I wholly say that I believe. Now he's asking a great question there. He suddenly sees maybe these two things aren't in opposition. Maybe they're related. How can I bring these things together? And of course, when you look at the question, the way he asks the question, it's begging for an answer because he's looking for a reconciler. He's looking for somebody who reconciles depth and height, maid and mother. He's looking for someone who is truth and will bring together what has been broken apart. And of course, it's almost a direct echo, that poem, perhaps some childhood memory of Sunday school, but of Ephesians, the prayer of Paul to the Christians in Ephesians, that you may know the length and breadth and height and depth and comprehend that with all the saints, the love of God, which surpasses knowledge, that you may be filled with all the fullness of God. And of course, Jesus Christ not only reconciles heaven and earth and the height and depth and has a ministry of reconciliation, but he's the one who comes into the world through someone who is both a maid and a mother. I mean, it's just extraordinary how much, well, as we know, the Mythopoeia poem of Tolkien's gave Lewis hope that perhaps there was a reconciler, that perhaps they could bring together the worlds. And of course, there was the famous walk in Addison's Walk, which had triggered the Mythopoeia poem, where Lewis had said lies breathe through silver, and Tolkien had stopped him in his tracks and said, they're not lies. They're not lies. Then he said, you see this tree, you think it's just a growing thing, it's all it is. And just as he was saying that, a rush of wind came and the leaves of the tree rustled. And then he said, no, this is a living sign, a powerful thing. It goes deep into your roots and mind. You can't even talk about thought without talking about roots and branches. You know, you can't talk about families without talking about roots and branches. This tree is myth woven and elf patterned. It's laden with meaning. It is and means far more than what it's made of or what its botany is. And you need the poets to help you interpret all these living symbols that the great maker is making for you and with you as you, and eventually, not long afterwards, Lewis becomes a Christian and writes to his friend Arthur Greaves that his long night walk and talk with Tolkien and Hugo Dyson had a lot to do with it. So I think what happened when he found in Christ, because of course Lewis loved myth, but the problem was that myths weren't true. And he knew some facts about Jesus Christ, but it didn't appeal to his imagination. He said to Tolkien, what difference does the life and death of somebody 2,000 years ago, even if they were raised from the dead, like bully for Jesus, what difference does that make to me? And Tolkien says, for heaven's sake, Jack, you know what the death of Balder the Beautiful means. You know what Adonis dying, you know, you love that stuff. Yeah, Lewis says, yeah, but it's not true. And Tolkien says, can't you see that in the case of Jesus Christ it is? That God has taken all the myths and stories that the pagans had that you loved and said, hey, I'm going to make this real, and actually brought it into the realm of history, into the realm of fact, into the realm of something that can be analyzed by the reason. Jesus Christ is somebody who will satisfy your deepest mythic imagination, but actually you can have trust in it because it's also actually happened in the world. And as Tolkien is saying that kind of thing, you can see the two hemispheres of Jack's mind, C.S. Lewis was called Jack by his friends, coming together. And they come together around the figure of Christ. And that coming together of the two hemispheres releases the incredible creative power in Lewis, in which he writes appealing equally, you know, to reason and imagination. But Kirsten mentioned a kind of preparatio evangelium, a kind of earlier thing.
Just Malcolm, before you get to that, I do want to note, like, that word reconcile is really a Latin word that means re-friend.
Yeah.
Just to go with our theme.
Yeah.
And actually, L.M. Montgomery, she used the two things, poetry and prose, was how she talked about the two hemispheres of the mind, of reason and imagination. So poetry.
Yeah, it's good to think about that meaning of the word reconcile. But if we go back to the dilemma that Lewis was in before this conversation with Tolkien, where he said the two hemispheres of my mind were in sharpest contrast. In theory, you might think that if he had been persuaded by reason, as he thought, of a purely cold, calculated, meaningless, data-driven account of the world, reductive, surely he shouldn't have had any time for myth or legend. Surely he should have dismissed his guilty pleasure and just carried on with reductivism. And yet his imagination was well alive and was reading all these stories with Tolkien, of all the myths and legends, and reading Balder the Beautiful and reading and rereading, in fact, George MacDonald. Well, Lewis himself says that he was given a kind of strange grace, that as a boy of 16, he picked up this novel, Fantastes, not knowing who it was by or what it was about, and started to read it on a train. And he felt luminous cloud kind of coming out of the book and into the carriage, and, you know, beyond, blessing the streams and woods that the train was going past as he rode into Surrey. And he says, I felt I was carried past the border. In fact, he says in an interesting and famous phrase, in some way his imagination was baptized. Now, it took a very long time for the rest of him to catch up with that. But I think in some way God was allowing him to sustain his imaginative life, even though he felt it had nothing to do with what is the case, so that the day would come when he saw those two hemispheres coming together and Christ being fully, as it were, mythically, imaginatively resonant in the great fulfillment of every story of death and resurrection. But also, this is real truth. This is actual facts about God really has done this, and Jesus really did rise, on the third day, and there's an empty tomb, and, this stuff has suddenly come into the world that we can look at and handle and touch. And so there was a sense in which, even though Lewis was not yet a Christian, his imagination was already preparing the ground. And of course, if he later understood that imagination is the organ of meaning, it meant that when he was presented with the claims of the gospel and was persuaded rationally and ready to persuade others rationally, the case for God and the case for God having come and found us in Christ, it didn't become just a kind of little credo that you had to tick the box and now I've said that. It was fully redolent with the meaning of everything he'd always loved in other places, finally found its focus and truth in Christ. And so I think, of course, Lewis knew perfectly well that there is some quote unquote imaginary stuff that doesn't do you any good, and that we're all fallen, and that there are dangers, and he explores those in his own way in his fiction. But there was something profoundly reconciling to go back to that word, reconciling in the whole way we know the world. And I think that power of reconciliation was itself one of the things which allowed, in the circle of friendship and kindred spirits, all kinds of reconciliations to go on in a world that was academically divided, philosophically divided, religiously divided. Lewis and his friends somehow overcame those divisions and began a kind of imagined another possibility. And I'm very conscious that one of the effects that Lewis and kindred spirits from George MacDonald right through have is in fact a reconciling one, that they draw together. I have friends that are really good friends of mine because we're kindred spirits, because we've discovered we love the same things in Lewis and MacDonald, who are from completely different church traditions from me. And we could argue till the cows come home talking about baptism, about whether it should be infant or adult or any of those things. And then I'm not saying they aren't important issues, but we've found a living truth to which all those things point. And we found that Lewis and kindred spirits are keepers of those truths and beautiful retellers of those stories. Sorry, I've spoken for too long. I can't hear you, Kirsten, you're muted. You're still muted.
Oh, there we go. The host wouldn't let me unmute.
Anyway, so I hope this sorry, it's a bit long, but there you go.
No, drawing together that, and I think we need to move into question time. But Brenton, could you set us up just before question time with that understanding that to be fully human, to be a healthy relational being, we need to be pulling together imagination and reason. Maybe even just understanding that it's not even that they're not dichotomies, but they're inextricable from one another. That to have these organs together, working together, is part of what it means to be fully human.
Yeah.
With our, especially in the Western world, a history that sort of has historically sort of said imagination is dangerous. Don't have a wild imagination, imagination out of control. How is it possible for us to cultivate a richer imagination in a culture that's been telling us for so long, reason is up here, imagination's down here? If we're going to shift that, like Malcolm has invited us to, how do we healthily cultivate a richer imagination that is kindred, reconciled with reason?
Yeah, interesting. So, let me say a no and a yes. Is that okay? I'll answer it in two ways. Absolutely. So the no comes out of Tolkien's poem. Somebody noted in the chat, there's, beautiful mathematics and things like that. And I remember hearing a story about someone trying to explain quantum mechanics, quantum physics to someone who's a real doubter, just a journalist trying to understand even what they're trying to write about, and interviewing this Nobel laureate and things like that. And then, the scientist at some point just stopped and said, look, I don't think you understand how elegant this theory is, right? And where would we be in science without models, images, playfulness, all that kind of thing, right? But there's a no that we say not to science. I mean, I'm really glad for, you know, great toothpaste and hot showers and electricity, and look at the way that and look at the way that technology was used so that we can connect across the globe today in the midst of all kinds of interesting chaos and difficulty and quick moving things. But we say no to someone who says that all that is that there is no more than what we can touch, taste, see, measure, or say what's not there. So we don't reduce everything to science is the thing that we're saying. And Tolkien says that I will not walk with your progressive apes, erect and sapient. Before them gapes the dark abyss to which their progress tends, if by God's mercy progress never ends, and does not ceaselessly revolve the same unfruitful course with changing of name. I will not treat your dusty path and flat, denoting this by that, this, and this and that by this and that. Your world immutable, where in no part the little maker has with maker's art. I bow not yet before the iron crown, nor cast my own small golden scepter down. So Tolkien instinctively knows that for him to be a maker in the world, for him to reflect the image of God in the world, to be a sub-creator, a little maker, is to say no to people who would dethrone that making in us and replace it with a system. Now that could be a system of government, a system of knowledge, right? Even a system of education or something. Anytime we take all of our reality and reduce it to something material like that, it takes away our ability to be those people that play with ideas and image and imagination and love and things like that. And Tolkien says we have to say no to a certain, use the word reductionism, I think, Malcolm, right?
Yeah,
To a
exactly.
certain so that means just taking everything and just bringing it down to what was it? A star is some matter.
Yeah, a star is just a ball of
just
gas.
a ball of burning gas, right? Thank
that's
you.
not what it is. It's only what it's made of.
That's right. So thank you, Raimundo. And Raimundo, I can't say his name. And but Pumbaa, yeah, too, also from The Lion King. So that's the no. The yes, I can actually say more briefly, and that's just that. Then, knowing that that's not all there is, that all there is not all that there is. How do we play in the world?
Yeah.
Now, see, love has meaning, right? And do you see our vocation has meaning? And so I think for our cultures now, in a world that really wants to be, everything has to be effective and efficient and useful all the time, I think we have to do ineffective, useless things. We have to be inefficient. We have to walk through woods and name the trees, even though somebody else has that list. They're already on Wikipedia. We're not necessary in the woods, right? And we have to spend time with family, right? Even when we have all these things to do. But especially I think we need to do is recover some of the lost arts that people like the Inklings had in their studios of the mind and heart. So things like poetry, things like reading mythology, things like asking hard questions, even impossible to answer questions, things like tea and drinks and connection with friends, and long walks, and all those sorts of things, naming pets, and there could be 100 things, and I'm glad we have Malcolm here, because as a theologian, as a pastor, you speak in one kind of way. As a poet, you bring that whole kind of world together, imaginatively for us, in an art that we are in some danger of losing. The younger generation read more poetry than my generation did, so that maybe there's hope.
Yeah.
But we haven't had a Harry Potter for poetry yet, the way that Harry Potter renewed fantasy, the way that Narnia renewed fantasy, the way the Lord of the Rings established new fantastic forms. We haven't had that for poetry, and we need that, I think.
Yeah. Well, funny you should say that. I'm thinking about trying to retell some of the great resonant stories of the British Islands, the Arthurian stories, which are of course woven and patterned with the Christian faith and with the, you know, but also full of magic and anyway, I'm beginning to think about doing that more or less for the sort of Harry Potter type reader, funnily enough.
Yeah.
But Lewis, you know, I think the very fact that Lewis, as by that time a very distinguished professor in Oxford, suddenly started writing books for children was extraordinarily kind of countercultural, and you know, and in fact it got him into trouble. I mean, people, Oxford didn't like, in fact he came over to Cambridge, but you know, Oxford didn't like Lewis writing all these extracurricular books. They thought it was a bit infra dig, you know, but he never lost touch with the child in himself, in fact, and that's what gave him you know, power. I mean,
yeah, that's cool. Yeah, remember that point in the essay for children where Lewis is like, what do you mean writing for children, right? That doesn't mean anything, right? You go to a child, man to man, chest to chest, beard to beard, as the you know, like in the medieval sense, right? And that's who you write to, because like certainly they're superior to us in so many ways.
Yeah,
right?
absolutely. Well, I mean, Coleridge has said that a poet is a person who brings the vision of the child into the powers of the adult.
Oh,
You know?
wow.
So, but also, I mean, Coleridge is a figure who lies behind a lot of one of the people who first got Lewis to take the imagination seriously as an actual organ of meaning and a clue to what is the case, or a missing element in our account of what is the case, was his friend Owen Barfield. And Owen Barfield was deeply rooted in the writing of Coleridge. Coleridge had said that, first of all, he said the imagination was part of the imago Dei in us. He said it was a repetition in the finite mind of the eternal act of creation in the infinite I am. But he also said, which lots of scientists and philosophers would now agree with, that as well as being the creative thing, it's the living power, Coleridge was the living power and prime agent of all perception. That actually just to take the jumble of data that's streaming in through your senses and firing your synapses, that's data. It's your shaping imagination, pulling out what's significant, that forms before your vision the beautiful human face of the person you love, or the shape of the mountain or the sky. And Coleridge's great insight was that however much you studied the physical composition of the stuff of the world and the laws by which it operated, which is the realm of a certain kind of material science, it was rather like if, you know, you gave somebody a poem without telling them that it was a poem, and they spent ages and ages with a microscope looking at the exact kind of chemical composition of the ink and doing geometric drawings and statistical things about them. They could accumulate a huge amount of genuine factual information without ever knowing it was a poem. And if you said, oh, by the way, it's a poem, why don't you read it? None of the information that they had gathered would be false. None of it would be less true. Some of it might be quite interesting and useful, but they've missed out the main thing. And Coleridge, thinking about education and thinking about how you bring up children well, wrote a poem for his little boy Hartley when the kid was slumbering, about how he wanted him to go out for those walks, to do all those things you just said, Brenton. And he said about this, I think one of the most powerful insights, and certainly all the Inklings knew this poem. Coleridge says about seeing the lakes and sandy shores and mountain crags. He says about his little boy, he says, so shalt thou see and hear the lovely shapes and sounds intelligible of that eternal language which thy God utters, who doth teach himself and all things in himself, great universal teacher. He shall mold thy spirit, and by giving make it ask. And I think one of the most important things that Lewis and Kindred and Spirits can do is not only to have we delight in their stories and we sense something alive and drawing and beautiful and holy and enchanted in there, we come away from their stories and we go for a walk in the woods, or we look on the face of a beloved friend, or we enjoy, and suddenly we feel that as in a rich way. The richness of the story brings a richness back to life, and we begin to see that somebody or something, we shall not reckon without our host, is actually speaking to us through all of this, and that we've been given finally ears to hear and eyes to see.
Good, thanks.
I think that's a beautiful place to wind us into the questions. Thank you, gentlemen, both. I wish we had several hours to sit here and talk about this, and talking about constraints. Malcolm cannot stick with us until 2 o'clock because he's got another responsibility. And so we'll probably direct some more questions towards Malcolm while we have you, and then shift them to Brenton. As I try to say in the chat there quickly, if you, I'm assuming many of you have already, if you put your questions in the chat, I'm not going to be able to track the chat and talk. And so there is a team that's going to direct send those questions to me and collate ones that are similar together. And as those are coming in, and let me just make sure I've got this lined up. Can you each both tell us quickly the Narnian moment that has most changed who you are? Or I would hate that question. A Narnian moment that has changed who you are or how you think about things.
Yeah. Well, for me, I don't know if Voyage of the Dawn Treader is my favorite, because each time I read, as long as I'm open to a different reading for the different books, I then all of a sudden just want to spend time with that book, right? You know, there's a kind of thing there. But Voyage of the Dawn Treader, for me, had a number of those moments. So the undragoning of Eustace, which is really also his baptism, and also the baptism of the imagination that Malcolm talked about. And then we also have there's this great moment, the star thing is obviously my kind of awakening of how everything I've been thinking for years was starting to fit together, basically. But there's this moment on the ship of the Dawn Treader, and they're in this terrible dark place, this magically dark place that's got them coned in, and it's a place of madness and lostness, and there really is nothing they can do. Others have spent their generations, their lives there. But there's this at one moment, and of course Lucy has something to do with this, and I think Lucy's name evokes light and seer and all kinds of things. Lucy, there's this moment where there's a beam of light that shoots down onto the deck from above, and everybody sees the light, and you've seen kind of shafts of light come in with the little flecks of dust in the light, and you can kind of see light in a sense. But then Lucy, always perceptive, looks up along the beam of light, and she sees that there's an albatross in the shape of a cross riding in the skies above, and they follow the albatross out of the darkness. Now, we can't do it all now, but do two things. If you can find the Meditation in a Toolshed essay by C.S. Lewis, and I can give you a copy if you don't have one in your library. And that's what he's trying to do, is he's saying life is about seeing those two types of thing. It's a lot different being a lover in love and being a psychologist studying someone in love. And he wants us to bring those two together, which everything we're talking about today. And then the second thing is then read Coleridge's Rhyme of the Ancient Mariner, which has the albatross, has the ship. Like it's not just a wink, but I think each time you read them together.
The Voyage of the Dawn Treader is really Lewis's sort of tribute back to Coleridge. And I mentioned already Coleridge's influence. I mean, you know, Coleridge famously in that poem has the line, as idle as a painted ship upon a painted ocean.
Yeah. Oh, wow. Yeah.
The book starts with a painted ship upon a painted ocean. Yep. I remember I was very excited when we left Africa and came to Cambridge because the Voyage of the Dawn Treader starts in Cambridge, in Eustace Scrubb's house, where there's the painting of the Dawn Treader. And they come into the painting and they get part of it. And I was longing to find the house with the picture in it so I could be there too. But to answer awesome. Kirsten's question, I'll give you a Narnian moment. That there were many Narnian moments when I was young and reading them, but I went through in a way, a very similar path to C.S. Lewis, in that my reason wouldn't let me at that point be Christian. I wanted it to be true, but I didn't think it was true. And I was really struggling with it. And whether it was just mythology or whether it was really the case, and what was the basis for putting my trust in it. And one of the things I did in that summer before, in fact, I did return to faith, was to reread the Narnia books, and with new eyes. And the thing that was really life-changing for me was the famous scene in The Silver Chair, where they've gone down into the underground and they've sort of been captured by the queen, who's the wicked witch there, who casts a spell on them. And if you like, it's an enchantment of disenchantment. It's actually about saying, oh, there's never been anything except this cave. And they said, well, but what about the sun? And she says, look, I've got a big round lamp in my cave, and you've just looked at my big round lamp, and all you did was project out there and you made up the sun, but really all there is the lamp. And eventually somebody says, what about Aslan? And she says, oh, look, I've got a cat. You've just made up a bigger and better cat, but only my world, my little world, I've reduced everything to this, and this is all there is. And she's putting this kind of magic powder on the fire and making them and doing this dull thudding rhythm. She's kind of hypnotizing them into this reduced. And good old Puddleglum, this is so powerful, because Puddleglum is the sort of supposedly pessimistic character. You'd think this would be music to him. Yeah, there's never been anything but this dullness, too bad, you know. Something stirs him and he puts his foot in the fire. He sacrifices, you know, he wakes them up with the smell of burnt marshmallow. And then he does this great speech where he says, he concedes everything apparently to the so-called reasoning of the witch. Maybe you're right. You know, maybe this dull little world of yours is the only one. Maybe there is no sun. Maybe there's no Aslan. Maybe there is no Narnia. Maybe we've all made it up. But then he does a piece of reasoning. He says, but how is it that two small children and a not very bright marshwiggle, between the three of them, can make up a world all by themselves that knocks your world into a cocked hat? Yeah. Well, okay, perhaps you're right. Maybe there is a Narnian, but even if there isn't a Narnia, I'm going to live like a Narnia, like a Narnian. I'm going to live for Narnia, even if it's not there, and I'm going to go out and try and find it. And for me, it was struggling with this very question. I wish Christianity were true, but maybe it isn't. I suddenly saw the huge power and depth, including all the poets I'd love to read, not only Lewis and Tolkien, but, you know, Spencer, and that all these people who were Christian seemed to be able to tell a story and weave a spell and evoke a thing in my heart that actually made more sense to me than the reductive stuff I was reading. And that thing to say, I'm going to give it a go, I'm going to put my trust in it, I'm going to back the intuition that it's true, on the basis that there's so much beauty in it that it's got to have something behind it. And that was a really, you know, I was reading obviously a work of fiction and an imaginary book, but it was actually the moment of sheer reasoning on the part of Puddleglum in that story that moved me forward and allowed me to dare to put my trust in this great story that God was telling us in and through Christ, and that Christ.
That's awesome.
Myself. So that was a really crucial moment for me.
Yeah, that's awesome. And he was writing that, by the way, as he's writing the preface to Mere Christianity.
Yeah.
So everybody has a context of Lewis's.
Yeah. And in fact, of course, what he's doing is he's revisiting the great Platonic myth, the Plato's myth of the cave. And, you know, it's incredible. I mean, I keep going back to that passage, and there's more and more in it.
And I will make that as a caution. If you read Lewis, like, so a lot of good scholarship on Lewis says this is going on in this. And I think that's great. Where we err with Lewis is if you say, this is the only thing that's going on.
Yeah.
To say this is Plato is not to say that it's also not three other things or four other things.
Oh yeah, absolutely. It is.
Yeah, that's right. And when we leave it open, we not only get a fuller sense of these books we're talking about, but like he actually raises the Plato's allegory up to the level of what children can read.
Oh yeah, but
and there's not many people that can add to the Rime of the Ancient Mariner, but he gives a lift, a life to it for our generation.
Yeah, absolutely.
No, you also really need to interrupt you guys. Yeah. Because I'm loving listening to you, but I have so many questions here, and this actually this first question here pulls some of that in, because given that MacDonald and Tolkien, as well as Lewis, all these Inklings pull in these conversations, are engaging with these conversations with people writers I identify as kindreds, but aren't always all Christians. They're still kindreds. So this person, well, and several of the questions wrap around this, but the way this is worded is helpful to pull us in. I've been reading a lot of Le Guin for my thesis and thinking about how her work and Inklings interact. And I think both of you gents would agree with me that Le Guin is a kindred. However, Le Guin is not a Christian. And so this person's asking that Christian story is essential to the Inkling understanding of meaning and myth making. But where does meaning and truth come in if someone is outside of the Christian tradition, as Le Guin was, as some of these other writers who are part of this, nonetheless, this company, MacDonald sometimes calls them faithful doubters, and that are, part of our company here today. Is that, are you arguing that you can only access this if you know the Christian story? Hard question. Malcolm, I'm going to give you first because your time is limited, and then we'll take that over to Brenton.
So,
and remember, I've got a few other questions.
so we have to start with the fact that God made absolutely all of us in his own image. And we've all agreed that that creative imagination, when it's working at its deepest level, is part of the imago Dei in us. Tolkien puts it in Mythopoeia, we make still by the law by which we're made. So at the deepest level, when somebody is doing their very best to work with the best images and myths they have from their own culture or their own personal upbringing or whatever, and to weave a story that's true within itself with that, we can expect some truth to be coming out of that. And of course, the most obvious example is that Lewis and Tolkien themselves found pagan stories that nevertheless resonated for them. So I don't think we, in following them, should be saying, oh, I need to know that somebody is a card-carrying Christian before I read their story. Contemporaries. I need to look for what is true and beautiful and resonant in that story. And if it really is true and beautiful and resonant, then for me as a Christian, it will not be at enmity with my faith, but may illuminate it. And sometimes, and when I wrote a book about poetry, I had a chapter called Doubting Faith and Reticent Hope, in which I talked about the poetry of poets who are avowedly not Christian, nevertheless speaking into the thing. Now, in the case of Ursula Le Guin, I mean, I think she's a really superb writer and is a mythopoeic writer in the deepest sense of that term. And I certainly learned a huge amount of true wisdom from the Earthsea trilogy. But what's interesting, of course, she's not a Christian, but she's writing in a world which has Christianity available to it as a possibility. And she's in conversation with that. Now, she's not only a doubter, but she's an asker of searching questions. And she has serious issues with what Christians understand by the atonement. And with, I think she has, in a sense, a kind of misunderstanding of the atonement, but she tries to express that in stories. So there's a very famous short story of hers called The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas.
Oh, yeah. Wow.
Which I know some Christians throw up their hands in horror and say, oh, she's attacking us. No, she's asking a very, very important question. In that story, you may know she imagines a world in which everybody is amazingly happy. But it turns out that they're allowed to be happy. Their happiness has been, as it were, magically purchased by the fact that there should be one person who suffers for everybody. And that person is a child who's suffering horribly in a basement. And she has the idea that if you really thought that this child was suffering to make you happy, you wouldn't accept happiness on those terms, and therefore you would walk away. Now, in that, she's using that story to explore, and she's offering a moral response to what she thinks is going on now on the cross, and saying we shouldn't allow ourselves to be given salvation at the cost of somebody else. But of course, the parallels break down very quickly. The child in that is not God. The child hasn't really, deeply chosen that. And, I would think that Le Guin story would be an opportunity for a conversation. I mean, ideally with Le Guin herself, but otherwise with lots of other people about, well, yes, you've got one aspect of it. It really is true that someone has chosen to suffer in your place. But you need to know much more about who that someone is. And of course, what The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas hasn't got is the resurrection. And it hasn't got that Jesus went to the cross for the joy that was set before him. It hasn't got the eucatastrophe, but she's using a story actually to probe and question. And I think, we ought to hear those probing and questioning stories written by others. I don't think we should shield ourselves and only read stuff that we know we're comfortably going to agree with, because I think our faith has an answer to those questions, but it can't answer them until it really hears the depth of the question.
Yeah. My answer is, I think, simpler. because I want to basically kind of agree with Malcolm. On the one hand, like I read, well, I read what tumbles into my life sometimes, but I read authors, partly whatever their worldview, that has some sort of agreement along the way. So like Earthsea and how men and women relate is a growing story of her own discovery of the relationship of couples and individuals and men and women. And I really want liberty in those ways, and I want growth and beauty. And so we agree together along that part of the path. And in the Hainish cycle, the way that you rethink the way that you encounter other worlds. So much of our past anthropology was just so rough and inconsiderate, and our colonialism and everything. And she reconfigures that, and I want to walk on that path. So there's that kind of, you can rhyme with part of an author's life, even if you don't rhyme with the whole. But generally, I like authors that do the yes and no that I talked about. They say no to reductionism, that everything is this one thing, and then they say yes to this risk and imaginative possibility of life. And that's often, for me, Christian writers like these Inklings, or sometimes individual Christians, Frederick Buechner or Marilyn Robinson or things like that, Flannery O'Connor. But it's often other people who just kind of open up possibility rather than close it. And lately I've been trying to discover the poetry of Canada's Indigenous peoples and First Nations, who, because of the difficult experience with the church here, have trouble believing what is sometimes their own Christian heritage in some ways. But they say no to exactly the things that we all want to say no to, but then they open up this other sense of possibility, and that's been a beautiful kind of discovery for me. So recently some of the Black women science fiction writers, Octavia Butler and Nnedi Okorafor and N.K. Jemisin and that group. So they do the same thing. They're saying no to similar things and yes to a bunch of things that we can love.
In that sort of response, and touch upon the rich diversity that is out there, and you're all being called into. Several people have asked for a little further unpacking around subcreation, and I love Tolkien's word affiliation. So this begging of, can you guys unpack a little bit further? What did Tolkien really mean by subcreation? This person says, I'm thinking of Tolkien's notion of affiliation and Iris Murdoch's notion of the call to completion in ethos and culture as a fruition of God's creation of cosmos. Or as Gunton and Trevor Hart ask, what will the creator and creature make together? It's been made.
Can I jump in here, because unfortunately I'm going to have to go after this, but I'll just do something about that. I think the first thing about, subcreation as a term, I know some people have difficulty because sub sounds like substandard or whatever. It's not what he means at all. The term is a term of humility. Mm-hmm. It's actually saying there is a great creator. There is one creator. Only God creates, in the fullest sense of that word, ex nihilo, out of nothing. He causes all these things to be. But then he gives us a creative role within his creation to do something. The same ideas resonate in Coleridge, and he used the term secondary imagination. That was his way of doing it. So that's the first. The point about subcreation is that it preserves the pure clarity of God's prime creation and doesn't usurp that for human beings. Now, the exfoliation, I think the biblical place to look for an idea that God might make us, as it were, collaborators, that having given us the power to make names and name things, he might be actually inviting us to work with him within his world, is in the strange little bit in Genesis about where God brings the animals to Adam, and it says to see what he would name them. Mm-hmm. Now, in one sense, God knows everything, but God is almost saying, I want you to have the fun of naming. But of course, in the ancient world, in the world out of which that text emerges, naming is no light matter. Naming is to do with nature. In the Bible, whenever anybody becomes a new person, they're given a new name. You know, Jacob becomes Israel, and Simon becomes Peter. You know, and Saul becomes Paul. You know, the naming is nature. So it's as though God has made the world thus far and said, now name with me. And of course, in Genesis, God creates things by naming them. He says, let there be light, and there is light. So right in the Genesis, in the prime creation narrative, is an emblem or an image of our being invited by God to take the material that he's already given us, the animals that have been created, but to join in that creative shaping and naming. And I think that's where our subcreation comes in. Lewis was very anxious that we might sort of pseudo-deifize ourselves and, you know, turn artists and so-called creatives into little gods, and he didn't want any of that. He wanted to make sure that everybody, you know, the woman who's sort of, you know, is washing the dishes, and you know, the person who's sweeping the steps, or you know, maintaining the city sewers, is just as much made in the image of God and just as glorious and beautiful to him as Beethoven. You know, that's important. But insofar as you have the power and the delight and the desire to make and shape, you can do that alongside God. And of course, the place where Tolkien explores this very beautifully is in the little story Leaf by Niggle, where the painter who can't quite finish anything, who's really talking, but nevertheless tries to do the little bits that he's done as well as he can, finds in heaven that God has given the gift of real being to the thing he made, and is asking him to keep making it. And that's a wonderful thing. I'm very sorry that I originally thought this was at 3 o'clock our time, and so, but I have a thing scheduled that I can't get out of. It's a lecture for Albany Cathedral in New York. I'm amazed by that. I mean, just the questions we've had so far, really deeply insightful and informed and central questions. So that would be that's just very impressive, and I would dearly wish I could continue the conversation with you, but I'm sure I will continue it with many of you in all kinds of ways as we meet. And I hope to be coming to Romania in November.
Yes, in November, yes.
So I very much hope to meet many of you who are on this call in person,
yes,
and continue the conversation then. Okay.
Dear Malcolm, thank you so much for being here with us. And just before you leave, let me take a picture with everyone, including you, right here, right? If you turn on your cameras, I will just do it right now for the history. When I'm writing the history, this is very, very important. Okay.
Yeah.
I'm waiting for everyone to show up. And yes, and thank you again. And please say goodbye to Malcolm, and see you in November, Malcolm, here in Iași, Romania.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Yeah, goodbye.
Okay. Goodbye. God bless.
Bye.
I'm amazed that just Malcolm, like just what he just brought up, Kirsten, because like I just the poem's not finished. I can't read it and it's too long, but I just wrote a poem called Naming as a Fearful Thing. And that is really just like exactly what he talked about. Like, this is one part. I do not know how to live as an unmaker in my making, to take breath while I breathe, for in my mind are the killing fields, filled with signs of flesh that once had life and name. These children once and sometimes still, who take up the subtle, intimate life, not of words and fingers that are on the fretboard and friendship, but the craft of the willing genius, and wound and kill and flay the flesh of all the little ones, once loved and named, and now in photographs, now in my mind. And then I go on from this to think about my son, who's a guitarist and a musician and songwriter, and ask that hard question of, you know, what do you do with all this? To name what you see, I think, is what I say is the songwriter's art, and make all that is in your heart a beating thing with flushing frame into a thing that is now in our world, a named thing, a world where there are those who would unmake you in a breath if they could. I cannot answer except to say that the world was made in a breath, and word and song, and is made still, for little makers though we be, and though there is sorrow that will break your heart, there is art in us, ingenuity, for love and life and friendship too, to name and thus shape the world we want to see. And that was sort of obviously an answer to Tolkien's own thing, and thinking about my son and kind of him being an artist in this difficult world. And that was sort of my answer, is that in being, we are named, and when we name, we're actually creating a thing, making a thing, we're shaping the world, and that there is some sense of our own destiny in that.
That's a beautiful response to a couple questions I had lined up to ask next, Brenton. As really, that was very beautiful. To flush out some of the bits of that question even more, how do we name? How do we remake, re-enchant wisely?
Yeah. So I hesitantly share a poem because I'm not really a poet. I'm a guy that writes some poems sometimes, right? Maybe 5 or 6 a year. So the magic of that moment is not is not terribly common. For me, I guess I somewhat go where Tolkien and Lewis and them have gone, because I like the ideas and I like the nonfiction and I like the academic and I like the fiction and the writing and the poetry and the friendship. And so for me, that crazy mix of all those things that the Inklings represented is sort of what I want to live out in the world myself, just based on my own giftings and my own story and my, although not always great with my context. Sometimes I feel a bit odd where I live. And so that's for me. But for Nicholas, my son, who's, Spotify is going to, you know what I mean? YouTube, like his thing, his renaming is going to happen in the songwriting. But I think in the end, he'll actually be a better resonator and shaper. He'll be a better producer and friend and mentor. Like once he's discovered the craft, and he'll probably be greater in what he does and helping others. And then, so for you, I think you plural, use, we say here in Prince Edward Island. For you, I think it really depends on your context. And I think that one of the most dangerous and beautiful things that we can do is have an institute like the one that we're in, to teach a class that opens up questions, to recover the sacred space of the university as a place we can talk about anything, to read imaginatively and openly, and then to carry that out into the world. And I keep using the word friendship because of the connection here, but in the end, you may not love your actual neighbor or something like that. So I think you still have to do that. And yeah, I think like in the end, like I have no answer to all the hard stuff except to just live well where we are. And I think that the writers that I tend to read, they have an invitation to spiritual life that I think is big and bountiful and expansive, and invitational. So that's what I would want to encourage. So
in that invitational sense, the Inklings and Kindreds were story makers that were invitational stories that draw us in, but they were story studiers as well. How much do you think, and there's a few things that feed into that how does that shape their way forward into equipping themselves with a wise imagination to be wise makers, to be wise namers? How important is it in what they ended up producing that they were teachers and studiers of story?
It's a good question. Remember, Aslan in Narnia often says, we can't tell you the other path that would have happened, right? If we, although that once that gets broken. So there's one time, I think it's poor Diggory and his mother's healing. We get a glimpse of another path. We don't know the other stories. Like if Lewis failed his entrance exam because of mathematics he would have failed it several times at Oxford, he never would have passed it. If he hadn't been given veteran leave to go to Oxford, like what would he have done? Like been a schoolmaster? He would have been terrible as a schoolmaster. I don't know. Like he probably would have, like who knows what he would have done, right? Maybe he would have tumbled into books, but it wouldn't be what we have. And Tolkien, I mean, like what kind of career would give somebody, the space and a little bit of money to just like keep writing pages and pages of words, like for years and years and years, and he still showed up for lectures and stuff, but his academic writing suffered at times because of the story. And so we just don't have another path. Like L.M. Montgomery, I wish she got to study. Like I think it would have filled out her possibilities a great deal. I wish she had that chance for that education. But I don't know. Like
Let's see if I disappear.
Yeah, but Susanna Clarke, for example, like the Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, right? I don't know what her education is, but I think she's just kind of writing books in the countryside or something. That's how I imagined it anyway. And she just came out with Piranesi, this new little novel, a small novel that's basically uses Owen Barfield, Inkling Owen Barfield's philosophy of thought as the structure for the fictional universe of the novel. Like what? So maybe we would, like, I don't know, maybe in the end there was just these stories that had to tumble out. But we have to remember that The Hobbit began in a hole. There was in a hole in the ground, there was a hobbit. It began on the back of a university paper. And that's just how history goes. So I would encourage, whatever your education is, folks, you can be great readers and great film watchers just by asking curious questions, by not presuming already going in, by being receptive to the story and then taking it, letting things crash together, that kind of thing. Yeah.
Would you agree that story seems more important again now than it has been, particularly fantastical fictional story? And is that good? Is that bad? Is that dangerous? Is that hopeful?
Well, yeah, story is dangerous. Like if you have a totalitarian regime, you should definitely ban fantasy. If you can't ban poetry, you should ban fantasy. Because once you create a new structure, you can talk about anything, right? Like, like once you allow for a fictional stream to exist, once you create a universe that is not one, that is different than the one you're in, the governments can't control, that fictional universe. It's in another shaper's hand, so they can make anything. And as C.S. Lewis said, I don't, he's like, someone accused him of escapism, right? Oh, these fantasy stories, they just send us off into another world. And there's a few good ways to push back on that, right? One, like, I don't know, sometimes don't you want to escape? Don't you want to just like pop on a movie after a hard day of work, sit with a book, right? Just disappear for a while? Doesn't it? Nobody else wants to do that. Why is that bad, right? Like, so sometimes the world is such that we should just, like close the door, run away a little bit. Two is, jailers are the ones that are most concerned with people escaping, right? We would think it a good thing for an innocent man to escape. And then the third thing is that it's actually kind of the realistic stories that promise us something that might be more dangerous for the escapist heart. But what fantasy does is it gives us all these great tools that equip us for the real world in ways that are imaginative and that are great for children and people with kind of open hearts. So it's true, we probably won't slay a dragon, someday walking down the street, although Romania being where dragons are housed in the Harry Potter universe, I think that there's some possibility, I guess, there. We're not going to probably literally slay a dragon. And to be honest, wouldn't you rather kind of find a way to study it for a bit or befriend it? You never know when Eustace is kind of kicking around. But we have dragons in our everyday lives that we have to slay. We have things we have to fight. We have, think about, jeepers, loneliness, mental illness, trying to do your work when you know you haven't been trained for it, trying to do all the stuff you need to do when you're just always just a little bit short on money or time or energy, right? Just think about parenting. Think about taking care of a parent who's dying or sick. Think of, okay, anyway, and so it goes. We need resources for life, and self-help, self-development books are a stream of that. But when we use that second way of seeing, there's this whole imaginative universe of tools and helpfulness to everyday life. And I think that's what Lewis wanted to respond to those questions. And so, yeah, so stories are dangerous, but they equip us for, I think, brilliant and beautiful and difficult things. Yeah, and the second thing is, Kirsten, you asked about like our stories kind of increasing. I think that we, this last generation of thought in the West has been very much brought back to people saying no to people who would name them falsely, right? So, I work in I'm a Christian thinker, and I work in a very liberal academic environment. But I in that environment, I'm never trapped by other people, because I can always say, no matter what, this is my story. This is who I am, and you can't limit me and define in your definition. And so personal story is such a good moment. And I think anytime that we want to renew story in a culture, that's good. The world was made as a story. History, is historical. L'histoire in French. The story is there, and the gospel, God's spiel in kind of the older English, right? God's story. Like there's just so much story there that's for our world. And then finally, I think story is on the increase, partly like it doesn't come down to one person, but boy, I think we owe a debt of gratitude to J.K. Rowling and the Harry Potter world that she made. I think that opened up a whole generation of readers, and maybe like Peter Jackson and the Lord of the Rings films too, and things like that. So there are people that are just, and there's just so much story writing going on that's so good, and we only know like a thumbnail of it in the whole universe of story.
Yeah. In that, can you speak a bit more to diverse voices in story that you alluded to?
Yeah, I guess I have a couple thoughts about that. I would love, and people, like, we can't all keep track of the chats, but if you have one of these great saying yes to things storyteller that we might not know about, feel free to put it in. Who knows who might pick it up. It's easy to just stay in the stories that we know. I think it's easy to stay on the block that we know, the neighborhood we know. And so what we end up doing is creating kind of like in living just in one neighborhood, we create a small neighborhood of thought and creativity. And so for me, now that I'm not kind of fighting to do a PhD and stuff, I've really been trying to just look for other ways of looking at the world, other ways of thinking about the world and things like that. And so I've been trying to open up. So like I said, my fantasy reading, I just said, well, there's quite a number of Black women fantasy writers, sci-fi writers. My favorite was Octavia Butler. And so I'm just going to read them all. I'll just just keep like that. That'll give me 2 or 3 years of bedside reading. Why not? Right. And so that just like, they just think of things in just ways that I don't, and I lived in Japan for a period. And I was a non-religious kid growing up in a highly Catholic place. And what I noticed about the two experiences was that in both, I was completely other. Now, not always negative other, but like there was never a moment in Japanese public where someone wasn't looking at me. Right? Now, occasionally there was anger or resentment, occasionally something on the edge of visual violence. Sometimes the shopkeepers are a little too polite. It was almost all curiosity, right? But I lived as an other. And for some of you, you have had that experience. Often that's attended to race, that you just simply, a Black person in my community is just always going to be something other, or at least for maybe another few years as we diversify. It's just, the reality. And that really has awakened me to trying to understand things from different perspectives and to understand other stories. And then in reading Lewis, I didn't know this for a long time, but in reading Lewis, I realized in the end that for him, diversity was absolutely essential. That for him, whenever you blend things together, it becomes just this like blurry mass. He said you lost all the beauty of life. So it's true. He looks a bit stodgy at points, but I actually think he's really imaginative in helping us open ourselves to different ways of experiencing things. And I think the way that he ends his book, An Experiment in Criticism, a long essay, is, I read in order to know others. I want to see with myriad eyes. It's this gorgeous line that, of course, Malcolm would have been able to just quote the whole thing. It's just this, when I read great literature, Lewis says, I become 1,000 men and remain myself. And I think that's the potential that's there for literature, to awaken us to all these other stories. And but we don't lose ourselves in that, right? So
Yeah, our imagination is awoken to the imagination of others.
Yeah.
And if we do believe that humans are created in the image of an imaginative God, then there's so much out there to explore and discover. And that's quite exciting. Brenton, thank you so much for this time and for this thinking and this energy. And I'm sorry, y'all, that we didn't have time for all the questions, but hopefully we'll find venues in which we can ask for more and share more and engage more. And one of those venues is the C.S. Lewis and Kindred Society itself. And it's a new society. We're just getting our feet under ourselves. You saw from the video at the beginning the incredible work that Denise and Teradora and Dr. Albu, all these professors and teachers and friends in Romania have been working hard. I can actually see Dr. John Watts, who's a real medical doctor, up there on my screen in front of me, has been part of this since the beginning, of people coming together to try to create a space, and a diverse space of discussion of some of this imagination that's not just in North America, yet again, not just in England. And this is one of the really wonderful things about the society in Romania, is drawing together this diversity of voices and perspectives, and exciting things are happening. So I invite you to go find out more about them, consider becoming a member to support their work. Come to Romania for a conference if you can, or attend the Romanian conference online if that's necessary. Mm-hmm. There's a newsletter. There's different levels of membership with more exciting events like hanging out with Brenton and Malcolm and that sort of opportunity. I'm going to pass us over to Denise at this point in time to tell us a little bit more about that, anything that I've missed out, because without notes in front of me, I guaranteed to miss something out. But Brenton and Malcolm in absentia, thank you so much. And thank you all of you for joining us for this. This has been a lot of fun. And I think it's just created more and more and more questions and thoughts for everybody. Mm-hmm. Yes.
Well, we thank you for this enchanting conversation, and bringing us all in this amazing subject. We do have this longing in our hearts to connect and to share these deep desires of us, and longing for what is beyond what we experience. And yes, this is great that we can ask our questions and receive the answers, at least for some of the questions. But the mere fact that we can just stop for 2 hours and listening to this, and letting our hearts being somehow touched by all these things is just great. Because we have just a few minutes left, I will ask Professor Rodica Albu to say a word of thanks. She is the very professor who translated The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe for the first time in Romanian, and she is part of the team with us here in Iași, and she has been supporting in every way everything we have done in organizing the conferences. So, Rodica, if you want to say a few words to our guests.
You took me by surprise. I can only say, thank God, He has brought us together. Many years ago, over 30 years ago, I'm sorry to have to say that, a student of mine called Teodora Ghiviriga discovered The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe in the British Council Library in Bucharest. And she was the one who placed the book in my hand and said, look what I found, please read it, it's wonderful. And then that was in the late 80s. Then I translated it. It took me 2 or 3 years to persuade a publishing house to publish it, because they kept saying, and who might this be? We've never heard of that. It won't be bought by anyone, and so on. And finally, a young teacher of English approached me and asked me if I found it appropriate for her to study Lewis for within a PhD program, and that was Denise. And now we have to say that Denise is the engine of whatever is going on right now. I'm just an emerita, you know what that means. And I take advantage of Denisa's work in particular, and of Teodora's work, and of my work of the past. And as I said last time when we met, it's such a chance that all of you are now part of my life. I keep saying this. And again, thanks for all. That's all.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you, Rodica. You cannot call me an engine as long as I mainly trying my best to keep on the surface with the stream. And sometimes I'm wondering myself what is happening, but as I have survived so far and we intend to go on. And yes, we will come up with news about the C.S. Lewis and Kindred Spirits Society, and also with the C.S. Lewis and Kindred Spirits Conference in November on this and other worlds. This is the subject of it, and please join us here in Iași. We would like to make C.S. Lewis, his heritage, and Inklings known in this part, forgotten part of the world, let's say, in Central and Eastern Europe. Our dream is to take all this heritage and all this beauty and the depths of this teaching to the young people. We have 50,000 students population only in Iași. We have to find ways to make them discover how wonderful it is to read and how wonderful are these writers. And hopefully we will succeed, at least for one of them. I thank you again. Thank you, Teodora. Thank you, Mrs. Albu. Thank you, Kirsten. Kirsten is a wonderful friend. And we really love you. And we hope to make George MacDonald know here in Romania as well. And thank you, Brenton. And hopefully you will be with us in the conference this year. I have this hope that by November, the pandemic will be over. And because all the other conferences will not be possible in person, only our conference will be possible. And maybe everybody will like to come here in Iași to be part of it. We officially stop here because we announced that our meeting will be just only 2 hours, but we keep the Zoom open for you to communicate. And if you want to address words, I mean, everyone is free to go if you have other appointments. But if there are people who would like to connect, who would like to communicate, to talk or to say something, you are more than welcome. But for now, goodbye and see you to the possible next C.S. Lewis and Kindred Spirit Connected on Zoom in September, and for sure in November for the C.S. Lewis and Kindred Spirits conference on this and other words. We love you.